All right, guys, let's talk about something huge. Biden, Macron, and Starmer are practically dragging us into a World War III type situation. Why? Because of their delusional pride and apathy. They're basically greenlighting Ukraine to use their long range missile systems to strike deeper into Russia. But here's the kicker, it's not just Ukraine. These strikes are being operated with Western help. And what I mean by that is NATO surveillance, satellite imagery, and let's be real here, Western operators, who are the ones that are actually involved. And that's terrifying because in a full scale war, nobody wins. So today, I'm breaking this down into six critical areas, along with top geopolitical pundits' personal takes on the matter, for you to basically understand. So let's get into it. The first area, the decision to arm Ukraine with long range missile systems. Key details of this decision. The US, the UK, and France have all approved Ukraine's usage of long range missile systems, including systems like the ACTAMS from the US and the Storm Shadows supplied by the UK and France. These weapons are capable of reaching up to ranges to 300 kilometers or so, which gives Ukraine the ability to strike critical military infrastructure far from the front lines. Targets like Russian command posts, railways, airfields, and ammo dumps are now within the range, particularly in the region of Kursk, where they aim to use that area occupied by Ukrainian forces as a bargaining chip at the negotiations table. Interesting strategy, I must say. This decision will significantly escalate Western involvement and shift the dynamics of the conflict, clearly signaling the West's willingness to challenge Russia more directly. Here's what I have to say. These decisions are way too risky, if you ask me. I wouldn't advise them to go down this path at all. But let's face it, Western NATO allies are in a full blown desperation mode after Trump's win in the US election. So, it's no surprise they're pushing for a more risky action in Ukraine. And as I mentioned before, Western leaders haven't exactly been honest about Ukraine's use of these missile systems. They claimed they would be limited to the Kursk region when that's false. But just recently, on November 18th, 2024, Ukraine used the ACTAMS missile system to strike deep into the Bryansk Oblast, deep inside Russia for those who don't know. They hit an ammunition dump, directly contradicting what the Western leaders told the public and Ukraine itself. Honestly, I'm not surprised, not one bit. So, the context behind the shift. Previously, Western nations limited their aid to only defensive weapons, carefully avoiding any moves that might provoke Russia too directly. But the changing dynamics on the battlefield and Russia's continued offensive have led to major shift in strategy. Now, pundits like John Meisenheimer and Richard Haas are sounding the alarm. They argue that introducing long range missile systems could accelerate Russia's escalation response, potentially triggering a dangerous reprisals like cyber attacks or even conventional missile strikes on NATO territories. Both John Meisenheimer and Richard Haas are absolutely correct in their assessment here. As we also just recently seen, Russia basically did a ICBM testing missile that actually hit Ukraine, and we saw how that went. It would make more sense to withhold sending these kinds of advanced weapon systems, especially considering that Russia could respond by providing their own systems to allies or even enemies of NATO and the US. Both of these analysts are grounded in a realistic thinking rather than the neoliberal mindset that dragged us into this conflict to begin with. And let's be honest here, it's starting to look like incredibly desperate. The West knows their proxy war gamble in Ukraine isn't paying off. Take Russia's recent massive gains in the southern Donbass region as an example. It's a clear sign of how this conflict is shifting in Russia's favor, no doubt. Now, the strategic shift from the West. This approval marks a clear shift from a primal defensive posture to one that empowers Ukraine to take more offensive actions against Russia. It also signals confidence in Ukraine's ability to use these advanced systems responsibly and effectively. However, analysts like Gustav Gressel from the European Council on Foreign Relations warn this could either go either way. It might weaken Russian logistical capabilities, or it could just backfire, prompting Russia to launch even more intensive counterattacks. And the strategic risk here is significant. If Putin perceives this as a NATO offensive, it could justify a much heavier retaliatory measures as we have seen on November 21st, 2024. And let me just add something here. It's not just Ukraine using these weapon systems. It's retired or off duty NATO operators who are the ones that are actually targeting Russia. So, this whole narrative about having confidence in Ukraine's ability to use these systems responsibly is just a flat out lie for anyone paying attention. What this really does is escalate the situation even further by giving Russia even more justification to respond, whether in Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter. And let's also be clear, this so-called strategic shift by the West, it's just going to backfire in the long term even more for them. First, NATO's image will take a major hit. Second, Western leaders are showing they're acting out of desperation, not rationality. And third, more countries will start pulling away from the West's control, stepping out of its sphere of influence entirely because of the actions like this. Now, the second point, Biden's foreign policy versus Trump's peace oriented strategies. Trump's focus on deterrence and stability. So, Trump's foreign policy focused on deterrence, but with the goal of avoiding direct military engagement. He emphasized economic pressure on Russia while providing military support to Ukraine without provoking a direct confrontation with Moscow. Trump has also outspoken about NATO members not pulling their weight when it comes to the defense spending, a stance that has influenced his approach to European security as a whole. Now, Victor Davis Hanson, a conservative analyst, argues that Trump's foreign policy was pragmatic, managing to strike a delicate balance between confronting Russia and avoiding escalation as a whole. But here's the thing, Trump's position is actually one of the main reasons why Biden allowed Ukraine to attack Russia with the long range missile systems in the first place. In a way, it was like a big middle finger to both Trump and Russia. Now, this is going to create serious issues for both Ukraine and Trump's administration moving forward, because with Trump potentially back in power, his ability to engage with Putin will be a lot more complicated than before. If you really think about it, that's a huge shift. Moving on, Biden's escalation centric approach. Biden's decision to approve the usage of long range missile systems shows his belief in supporting Ukraine until it achieves its territorial objectives, even if it risks further escalation. Now, Biden's stance has been more assertive, with analysts like Thomas Friedman and Fareed Zakaria arguing that sending these missiles sends a clear message to Putin that the West will not back down. However, this could also push Russia to double down, particularly in areas like cyber warfare or energy disruptions. I'm going to be honest here. Again, this is Biden's last big middle finger to the world and to the Trump administration that's coming in. His administration is directly responsible for how this war has escalated, in my opinion. And have you ever wondered why Afghanistan's pullout was so rushed and completely unplanned? Well, it's because the US was pushing Ukraine to attack and retake the Donbass region from Russia. When Russia clearly told them to stop, we knew what was going to happen next. So when you look at Biden's actions, especially approving the usage of long-range missile systems against Russia, it's clear that all of this is going to do is just make Russia double down in terms of how the conflict's going to go in Ukraine now, as we are currently seeing. Now, the undermining of Trump's effort for peace. Brett Stevens, a columnist for the New York Times, argues that Biden's current strategy undermines Trump's initial diplomatic outreach, particularly with Russia. Trump aimed to avoid direct confrontation, even with his aggressive rhetoric. Now, Biden's decision to approve the long range missile systems marks a sharp pivot from Trump's more cautious approach, an approach that might have been designed to avoid the very escalation risks that Biden has now been driving into. So, in the end, what do we have? A perpetual war, one where the military industrial complex and its lobbyists can't help but smile and glee? As they say, war is a racket, an endless proxy war. And Trump's peace policy for the Ukrainian conflict, well, it stands to stark contrast to the money making machine of the American military industrial complex. This escalating actions will only solidify NATO, well, most of them, except for figures like Orban and Fico. The same can be said for Russia through its basically alliance that's growing stronger with countries like Iran, North Korea, and China. The global dynamics are shifting, as we can see, and it's not looking good for the West at all, in my opinion. The third, tactical strategic implications of long range missiles. Ukraine's tactical advantage is here. Sure, Long range missile systems like the ACTAMs and the Storm Shadows give Ukraine the ability to strike deeper into Russian territory, targeting key military infrastructure. This could potentially cripple Russia's ability to sustain its campaign. We have Mark Hertling, the retired U.S. Army general, who believes this move could give Ukraine a significant tactical advantage by limiting Russia's ability to reinforce positions and supply its forces. But here's the thing: Russia has so many logistical systems that even if Ukraine had 1,000 of these missiles, it wouldn't make a real difference at all. It's like asking Germans how their plan to mass produce 10,000 Tiger tanks was supposed to destroy the Soviet Union's tank reserves. There really isn't a tactical advantage here for Ukraine. All this will do is create more suffering and destruction, all while Western generals, with their low IQ ideas, keep worshiping these so called miracle weapons, making the narrative, as it is, a mythical one, and that is very unfortunate, in my opinion. Risks of Russian retaliation. Russia has made threats of escalating the conflict by targeting NATO countries that supply these weapons. Analysts speculate that Russia could ramp up missiles and drone attacks on Western supply chains or just basically retaliate against Ukrainian cities. Anatol Levin, a geopolitical analyst, warns that this move likely will provoke Russia to respond more aggressively, potentially targeting NATO's logistical hubs. He suggests that the risk of direct confrontation with NATO is increasing, which could force Western nations to escalate even further. This raises a serious concern. The cycle of retaliation could spiral out of control, leading to even a greater conflict than what it is. The West's approach, seemingly, is designed to pressure Russia, which could end up backfiring and dragging countries into this unthinkable escalation. The underlying question remains: are the risks worth it? And could this ultimately lead to confrontation that no one truly wants? Shocker, right? The public, especially those who believe in the mainstream media and those low IQ generals, are foolishly saying that Russia wouldn't dare challenge what the West or NATO is doing in terms of escalation. Well, spoiler alert, Russia's probably going to respond by proxy as well. Think about it: Yemen, Iran, and potentially North Korea. These are just few examples of how Russia could escalate regional conflicts in retaliation. And let's not forget, we haven't even seen Russia's full capabilities yet. I know. Many Ukrainian and NATO fanatics would argue otherwise. But the reality is, they're wrong on so many levels that it's not even funny. It's actually horrifying, to be honest. Underestimating Russia is a massive mistake. Just ask the French and the Germans. They can tell you all about it from their personal experience. Now, comparing approaches. While Trump avoided directly equipping Ukraine with offensive weaponry to maintain balance, analysts like Michael Kaufman, a Russian military expert, points out that Biden's strategy of arming Ukraine with long range weapons represents a shift toward outright confrontation. This raises the very real possibility of a broader conflict. For the world's sake, implementing at least some of Trump's foreign policy plans for Ukraine could have kept us from the brink of a third world war, honestly. Regardless of what happens when Trump gets back into office, it will be on Russia's terms on how this war ends, especially with the way we have provoked nuclear war right on Russia's front doorstep. This is a dangerous game, mind you, and one that might not end the way the West hopes it will, just by looking at everything that's going on currently. The fourth, Western unity and changing tones among leaders. Biden's leadership in NATO. Biden has pushed for stronger NATO unity, with Western leaders largely supporting Ukraine's effort. However, Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group, warns that the public opinion in Europe is increasingly divided as the conflict drags on. This could strain NATO's cohesion. Biden's challenge will be to maintain NATO's unity and support for Ukraine, especially as domestic political pressure grows in countries like Italy, Hungary, and France. And Ian Bremmer is correct here. Biden's decision to glorify NATO's invincibility works on a optics level, but not on a ground level. You've got a lot of Europeans, and yes, even many Americans, who are grown tired of having their tax dollars funneled into Ukraine, all while their own governments ignore pressing issues at home. Unity within NATO is slowly being tested. Look at two NATO member states, for example, Hungary and Slovakia. They're already showing signs of challenge. This is not sustainable if the war continues, in my opinion. So, Trump's push for burden sharing. Trump criticized NATO's members for not meeting their defense spending commitments, Walter Russell Mead, a prominent foreign policy analyst, argues that Trump's focus on cost sharing within NATO helped European nations take more responsibility for their defense, but it would also leave them vulnerable to Russian aggression. Biden's handling of NATO focuses on unity, but the question remains about how long NATO allies will continue to commit resources to Ukraine. Now, Trump's policy of making NATO members foot the bill is still, in my opinion, one of the best and fairest options, if America decides to keep their organization afloat, of course. Meanwhile, Biden's strategy, where NATO members in Europe are sending most of their equipment to Ukraine, raises a major concern: what happens if there are any future conflicts, particularly in Europe? That risk is still very much on the table. Divisions within NATO. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states strongly support Ukraine's cause, while France and Italy are more hesitant, concerned about escalating costs of the war. According to Charles Kupchan, a former National Security Council member, Biden must maintain a delicate balance to prevent NATO from fracturing over the war's extended duration. Well, those countries do have specific historical issues with Russia. However, the same could be said about Central America regarding America's own historical actions. It shouldn't be used as an excuse to ignore the bigger picture here. Now, there are specific rules for superpower countries like Russia and America. I'm sorry, but that's how the global system operates, though America seems to have a fewer checks on its actions due to its dominance on the world stage for now. But mark my words, once America's dominance is no more, you're going to see organizations like NATO not just fracture, but fall apart completely, just like the Warsaw Pact did when the Soviet Union collapsed. The fifth, long term consequences and missed opportunities for peace, escalation risks, and nuclear threat. By providing Ukraine with long range missiles, the West risks escalating the war, especially as Stephen Walt, a political scientist, point out that Russia may resort to nuclear or unconventional weapons if pushed too far, which, as I said earlier, happened basically November 21st, 2024. Some analysts speculate this could lead to a significant shift in the conflict, with the West facing an increasingly aggressive Russia, or a China backed Russia on the global stage. Well, spoiler alert, that's already happening thanks to both US sanctions and the usage of long range missile systems being deployed against Russia, and also antagonizing China over Taiwan. All the West has to do is just be rational, promote trade with these superpower countries, and respect their concerns as well. As they say, that's one of the key elements in the balance of power doctrine on the geopolitical landscape, where all the superpower countries prevent one another from basically supplanting themselves as being the global power of the world, which would be the multipolar world order. However, that unfortunately is where America is currently positioned. Missed diplomatic opportunities. Critics argue that Biden missed opportunities to push for a ceasefire or negotiations. John Bolton, the former national security advisor under Trump, suggests that Biden should have more focused on diplomatic solutions early in the war, before it escalated to the point where Russia might see this as an existential threat. Ironic, coming from a guy who is well known for being a warmonger himself, in my opinion. Though he is correct that Russia sees this conflict as an existential crisis, much like the Cuban Missile Crisis was for America. I think the diplomatic opportunities may come with Trump entering the White House again, though, as I mentioned earlier, Putin will be the one to dictate the terms, not America nor Trump. Now, resource strain on the West. Analysts like Michael O'Holland from the Brookings Institute suggest that the prolonged military engagement, especially with advanced weaponry, will strain US and European resources. This strain, in turn, could impact other areas of the global diplomacy, such as Asia or the Middle East. John Meisenheimer contends that the West could have focused on sanctions and diplomatic pressure rather than the military escalation. He argues that this could have been less costly in terms of its path moving forward. Now, here's where I kind of disagree with John Meisenheimer. Sanctions wouldn't have worked at this point, since Russia has already fortified its own economy since 2014. However, diplomatic pressure would have been the better approach to this conflict, though that too can be manipulated. Look no further than Boris Johnson's intervention on that. The sixth, two visions for U.S. foreign policy. Biden's gamble. Pundits like Anna Applebaum suggest that Biden's strategy is a high risk approach to counter Russian aggression. However, it also risks undermining Europe's stability if NATO countries grow weary of funding the war. Some argue that Biden's firm stance could eventually lead to Russia's basically withdrawing from Ukraine, but only if the West maintains its resolve. Now, I don't see Russia withdrawing from this conflict at all, which, let's not forget, the West has started it to begin with. Europe's stability has been in question long before this conflict officially began in February of 2022. So I think you're going to see Europe's resolve falter by next year, no matter how much these European leaders continue to push the narrative of supporting Ukraine to the end. So Trump's alternative vision. So Max Boot, a foreign policy analyst, argues that Trump's policy would have likely led to less direct confrontation and possibly greater leverage over Russia. However, it also might have emboldened Putin's ambitions, ultimately leading to a similar confrontation. Again, regardless whether Trump is able to sit at the table with Putin, it's really going to be up to Putin, not Trump, when it comes to any sort of resolution of this conflict. That said, I do believe Trump's vision for ending the Ukrainian conflict is better than Biden's. Biden has basically just escalated the situation to the point of risking more global conflicts, rather than keeping it contained as a regional issue. In the end, my final thoughts on all of this are that Biden's actions, especially that middle finger move at the end of his term, are slick but frankly insane. Considering where the conflict stands now, I feel that the military industrial complex and the jaded politicians in both America and Europe wouldn't have allowed Trump to stop this, even if he wanted to. One last thing, these missile systems, again, won't change the outcome of the war. They will only create more tensions than need be. Other than that, guys, if you can please leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and leave some good questions in the comments regarding this topic or any other topic, I'd be more than happy to read and respond to you. Other than that, take care.